In chapter 14, we're going to be talking about generalization. Generalization is a principle that has to do with our ability to take our research findings in our study and apply it to broader populations of individuals. After all, the goal of any research study is to find out some information about a group of people and see how it applies to other groups of people. So let's take a look at some objectives and get into the lecture. A few of the objectives that we have for this chapter are to discuss the issues created by generalizing research results to other populations, including the problems with college students as research participants. I know it sounds odd, but there are some characteristics of college students that make them easy to access, but difficult to generalize. We're going to talk about the issues about generalizing research issues to other cultures and ethnic groups. Talk about some of the problems of generalizing to other experimenters and other possible solutions to that. We'll be talking about replications, distinguishing between what an exact and conceptual replication is, and we'll also be talking about meta-analyses as a way to generalize. Let's talk about first external validity and the option that we have to use college students. So external validity is this overarching concept that says we can take the results of our study and generalize it to a broader population. And usually what that means is that if a study has the same characteristics as the general population, then we're in good shape. That means we're talking more about naturalistic observations or using the participant characteristics as a way to setting up our study. Generally, if we have a tightly controlled experimental design, we're less likely to be able to generalize it because the contrived study or the contrived setting of an experiment does not necessarily generalize well to the real world. Now, college students have come under fire for the actual usefulness to generalize to other situations. It's true that there is something characteristically different about college students, but we have to remember that college students are people too. And it's important to understand that we can generalize based on the characteristics of the college students. But here are some characteristics of college students that we have to consider. One is that it's a highly restricted population, meaning that it's a group that you have to have special access to. You have to become familiar with the institution that the college students are at in order to gain access to them. So they aren't just widely available to people outside of the institution. Inside the institution, they're widely available, but again, it's restricted. Usually they are young people with social and political attitudes that are in flux. That means that they are changing. They haven't settled on their social and political attitudes yet. So what you're really looking at is a snapshot. You have higher cognitive skills among college students than non-college students. Now, again, this is true in general. Clearly, there are people out there who are not in college who have high cognitive skills, but as a group of people, they have higher cognitive skills. And they're also more similar to each other than other people are to each other, if that makes sense. What I mean by that is that college students behave like college students pretty generally. Okay, meaning that a college student is more like another college student than a non-college student is more like another non-college student. There's a lot more variability in the characteristics of people who are not college students. We call it homogeneity when the group is more or less the same throughout. So in college students, you have a lot of homogeneity. People are generally the same throughout, whereas people who are not in college have so much more variation. So another population that can be tricky to generalize to are volunteers. So if you ask people to volunteer for a study, you have to know right away that there is something different about those people that are not like the rest of the people in a population. So it might be difficult to say that the results of the study using a volunteer is going to be like what you would expect for everybody else out there. Volunteers have several characteristics that make them less like the rest of the population. Usually volunteers are more highly educated, where they might value the importance of research. So there's some book smarts there to where people understand the value. They usually have higher socioeconomic status. People who volunteer generally are able to volunteer because they have the resources they need to spend time away from work. People who are volunteers are also people who tend to be higher in neediness of approval. So people who are volunteers will likely volunteer because it makes them feel good or that somebody will recognize them for their efforts, etc. People do volunteer altruistically because it's a good thing to do and it helps a cause, but lots of times people are also excited to get approval of other people. And volunteers tend to be more social. Those are people who are likely to go out of their way to engage in research, so they're more social. So those four characteristics make them a little bit more difficult to generalize to because they are not like the rest of the population. Another area that you have to watch out for in terms of how you make generalizations about your research is through online research. People who use the internet and can manage technology are a different demographic than people in general. So it takes a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more skill to be able to successfully engage in a study online. So you have to remember that you can't just say that, well, we found that through this online study that that people who make more money tend to spend it more frivolously. Well, that might be the case for those people that engage in the online study, but we don't know if that generalizes necessarily to people that were not a part of the online study. So when we consider the idea of generalization to other people, we have to consider sex, gender, race, and identity. So we have to remember a couple of things, that sex, gender, race, and identity have multiple different ways of being measured. So if you have a study that's based on the construct of gender, however you've operationally defined it, you have to know that you're not able to generalize things so precisely because of the way that other people might define their own gender. Same thing with race and identity and sex. You know, people identify in particular ways, and that makes it difficult to generalize because not everybody uses the same set of standards or rules, quote unquote rules, to define what they are. Some people choose not to define their sex, race, gender identity, and that's fine. We just have to remember that if we are using that as a way to measure something in a study, that we can't make generalizations about people outside of the study unless they use our exact definition, which is not usually going to happen. You can read through the text there. It's kind of a breakdown of what I've just studied. So just keep in mind that when we're using definitions, our best bet is to go with definitions that are used broadly. I like to use the U.S. Census Bureau's definition of sex, gender, race because it's something that is used very widely among different populations of people, and that kind of tends to be one of the more standard ways of looking at it. Is it all inclusive? No. But I don't know that anybody has the answer to how to have a comprehensive, all-inclusive list of what gender is, because gender is something that changes. Let me phrase this precisely. Gender is a construct that is continually morphing as we understand more about what gender is. So it's difficult for us to say that we have the list of all the genders. That's not true. Nobody really does. So we have to be careful how we make abstractions about our results based on gender profile. People who live in certain locations can also be difficult to generalize to. So you need to make sure that the people that are in your study are in a location that you can generalize from. So for example, if we did a study in the Midwest, we could probably generalize our findings to other people in the Midwest. We could not generalize our findings to people who live in sub-Saharan Africa because we don't have the same kind of experiences that those people do, even if it's based on our location. That kind of brings us down to culture. When we look at research studies, we find that most of the people in the research studies come from what are called weird cultures. I know it's just an acronym. It doesn't actually mean weird, but it stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures. So those 5 characteristics are prevalent among people who are in research. So when you do research, it's important to take a look at the demographic characteristics before you say that you can generalize your findings. You can only generalize findings to cultures that match the people that are in your study. Again, the big idea is we can generalize our findings to participants who look like those participants that were in our study. Research with non-human animals has gone back and forth in the ability to generalize. A lot of behavioral research early on, like in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, was based on the idea that we can generalize from animals to humans in terms of behavior. And while that's true, there are a lot of aspects that you can't, just because of the different complexity of the human brain compared to the non-human animal brain. So we must be careful about how we decide to use non-human animals in research, because it's not always something that can be transferable. Now, we've talked about college students as a way to find a niche group of people who have characteristics that are homogeneous, but there are some positives to it. So, in defense of college students, it's easy to criticize them using on the basis that they have these shared characteristics that are not shared with other people. They shared within their group, pardon me, but they're not shared with other people. Remember that college students are human, and that college student populations are diverse, and replication can be a safeguard against the fact that we're using college students. So maybe we replicate a study with college students and non-college students, and if we find the same results, then we can say, well, college students, after all, are representative of other populations. Now, when we talk about lab settings, what we're talking about are highly controlled experiments to where the conditions are such that you're not likely to encounter them in the real world. When we have a laboratory setting, we are not going to be able to say that we can generalize our findings to the real world, because the real world is not how the research study was conducted. Usually what we try to find from lab settings is what we call internal validity, meaning that we're looking for cause and effect to limit the effect that the outside world has, and we're just trying to see if the variables make a difference. So the artificiality of the laboratory environment does certainly limit our ability to generalize results. So be careful about how you decide to generalize results when they're based on laboratory settings, because they won't be generalizable for the most part unless you have a lab setting that very closely matches some other setting that you might experience in the world. It's not likely to happen, but I suppose it's possible. So how do we support good external validity? That is, that generalization. Well, what we try to do is we try to find when variables happen with one another. We want to see that variables have an impact on a study across all kinds of measurements. So if we had a very diverse population of individuals and we sampled from them, and our final sample had a good mix of race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, location, etc., if we had that kind of distribution of individuals in our sample, and we started to do our study, and we found that everybody in our study went through the study and had similar results no matter what their race, ethnicity, or etc. were, that means that we could generalize our findings, because we found that the participant characteristics did not make much of an impact. That really we were able to study the variables, and there was not a significant difference across different measurements that we were considering. So let's say, though, that we did this study and everything was the same for everybody except for a measurement was different between men and women. So it didn't matter what race you were, where you were from, but it did matter if you were a man or a woman. And if that's the case, then we have an interesting finding, but it limits our external validity because we can't generalize a finding that is not consistent across all participants. Let's take a look at what this looks like graphically, and we can kind of see what the interaction effects might be like. So here we have 4 graphs, and they're all measuring the same thing. They're measuring measures of aggression in a crowded situation. So we have measures of aggression, so there's low aggression and high aggression, and then how crowded a situation is low and then high. And the male line will be a solid blue line, the female line will be a dotted blue line. And in this case, they overlap. So the male and females both have low aggression and low crowding situations, and males and females both have high aggression and high crowded areas. In that case, we could generalize our results because there is not a difference between males and females in how they experience crowding and aggression. So that's good. We can generalize that to a population. In the second group, we have low aggression and low crowding for females, And then we have moderate aggression when there's high crowding for females. For males, we have moderate aggression during a low crowded situation. And for a high crowded situation, we have high aggression for males. So what this means is that the male and female participants responded differently in magnitude to the crowded situation. So males are generally more aggressive than females in both low crowding and high crowding situations, but they don't intersect one another. So that means that the effect at the low crowded and the effect at the high crowded have the same differences. So again, there can be differences, but the problem comes in when there is that there's a change in one or the other. So the change increases similarly between males and females in graph B. Let's take a look at graph number C, good gravy, graph letter C. For graph letter C, there is low crowding for females and low aggression for females, and low crowding and low aggression for males. So they start out the same. But here's the thing. In a high crowding situation, males get highly aggressive. Females stayed low aggressive. That means that there is a systematic change that happens. So we can't say that the effect of crowding is universal for males and females. The effect of crowding is different for males and females. There is a big change in males and not a change in females. So in this case, we cannot generalize because the effect of crowding is not the same for both groups. In graph D, the crowding for males is low-low. So you have low crowding, low aggression, and high crowding, high aggression. And for females, it's low crowding, it has high aggression, and high crowding has high aggression. This again has a systematic change between the variables, meaning that the amount of crowding impacts males and females differently. So again, we couldn't just generalize this to the population because there is a difference overall. Another way that we can help to generalize is by doing replication studies. If we do a replication of a study and get the same results, but maybe we do it with a different different sample of individuals, we can increase the ability for us to generalize our findings because we're finding more and more people that a particular phenomenon works with. So if we're measuring some kind of treatment and we measure it with males and females, and then we use different ethnicities and different sexual orientation, we get the same results, then what we can do is we can say that it appears to be a generalizable phenomenon because it works with many different populations of individuals. There are two ways that we can do a replication study. One is by using an exact replication, where we use somebody else's study exactly as it is in order to conduct a new study. So we can replicate the study using the exact same procedures and everything, but maybe switch up the populations that we're using so that we can study a different type of person. A conceptual replication is where we use different procedures to replicate a research finding. So maybe instead of using a particular measurement of happiness, we use a different measurement of happiness. So we can generalize to different measurements or different instruments, and we could also generalize to a different population. So as long as we're measuring the same basic concept and getting to the same conclusion, we can use a conceptual replication without having to use the exact same method and procedure as the previous study. Another way that we can evaluate the generalization is by using literature review. And what that does is it finds where we can look for the same kind of information but done by different authors. So we can collect things by topic to see if other researchers are kind of hovering around the same idea. And if they are, then we can add to that body of research and we can create more generalizability. Meaning that if we increase the amount of information about a particular topic and our research is done well, then we can start to generalize that particular topic to many different populations. A meta-analysis is also very helpful. So instead of conducting your own research, if you were to go through and find a bunch of other research and look at their findings, you could combine information together in a way that suggests that we can generalize results. So the meta-analysis is about going through a lot of other studies, looking at what they were studying, looking at their findings, and combining them into a research article that talks about the fact that authors A, B, and C are all studying the impacts of race on police aggression. Okay, kind of a hot topic right now. We could find that all these researchers are finding the same thing in different locations, or with different sized police forces. So maybe rural versus urban. So we could use a meta-analysis in order to look at the quantitative conclusions that we found from other studies and create our own conclusions that kind of wrap everything into one. So when we're talking about using research, we are trying to do it to improve lives. I don't think anybody's out there to do research to make anybody's life any more difficult. So we're looking to impact overall health, law and criminal justice systems, educational environments, and work environments. The idea is that we want to use what we have available to us in order to generalize to other people in a way that we can improve their lives based on the topic that we're studying. There's no point in not generalizing research when we can, because all we're doing is hogging it for ourselves. We want to make sure that the research that we're conducting is fruitful and is improving lives somewhere. That's kind of the oath of the psychologist, is to try to improve lives. So that's chapter 14. This sets up a lot of information about how we are trying to do research and what the purposes of generalizing to different populations. If you have questions, let me know. I'd like to see what you can do with this with the article response, and we'll see you next time.